Welcome to the Moffitt Method Podcast, where longtime strength and conditioning coach Tommy Moffitt explores everything from the art of coaching, improving performance, sports nutrition, and mental training. Now, welcome your host, Coach Tommy Moffitt.
Welcome to the Moffitt Method Podcast, and I am your host, Tommy Moffitt. If you're listening for the first time, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. The purpose of the podcast is part educational and an opportunity for me to introduce and highlight, like today's guest, some of the great coaches, administrators, and friends that I have come to know and respect during my coaching career. I think the listeners will enjoy the variety of the guests and topics that are discussed and hopefully come away with a few knowledge bombs that help your teams to excel to greatness. Our amazing guest today is Coach Ryan Metzger, Assistant Director of Olympic Sports Performance at the University of Tennessee. Coach Metzger was a recipient of the 2022 NSCA Assistant College Strength and Conditioning Coach of the Year. Arrived on Rocky Top after serving as the Senior Assistant of Olympic Sports, Strength and Conditioning at Clemson University since 2019. While at Clemson, Coach Metzger was directly responsible for the strength and conditioning efforts of women's soccer and football, as softball, as well as having direct oversight of all volunteer interns. Before her time at Clemson, Coach served as the assistant sports performance coach at Virginia Commonwealth University. During her time at VCU, Coach Metzger was directly responsible for field hockey, women's lacrosse, cross country, track and field, and was also the intern director for Olympic sports. Prior to VCU, Coach Metzger served as a graduate assistant at the University of Kentucky. Coach worked with several programs, including football, women's basketball, volleyball, and women's soccer. Coach earned her master's degree there in exercise physiology. Coach Metzger, who was a gymnast at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh, earned her bachelor's degree in exercise science and health promotion with a minor in strength and conditioning in 2011. While working primarily with football, Metzger has continued to stay competitive in athletics and currently competes in Olympic weightlifting. She has competed in multiple national events and managed to earn a handful of national medals, most recently finishing second in the snatch and third in total at the 2018 American Open Finals. She competes not in the 55 kilogram class anymore, in the 49 kilogram class, and frequently ranks among the top 10 in the nation in her weight class. Coach Metzger currently holds certifications in SCCC, CSCS, and RSCC through the Certified Strength and Conditioning Coaches Association and the NSCA. She is also a level 1 sports performance coach through USA Weightlifting and is FMS level 1 and FCS certified. That's a lot. Welcome to the podcast, Coach Metzger. How are you and the rest of the volunteers doing today?
We are amazing. Thank you so much for having me on here. I was about to say that was a mouthful.
Yeah, the introduction is the hardest part.
You crushed it.
I don't know about that, but yeah, that's always the hardest part. So we were talking before we start. So what led you to want to drop weight classes?
Oh, okay. We're going to lead with that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have been competitive in weightlifting on the national scale for about 10 years. So I started my journey at the University of Kentucky when I was a GA there. I was a 53, did okay. You could do like mediocre and still be national level at that point in time. The sport has gotten really popular. There's a ton of participants now. It's very, very competitive. And you know, the weight class has changed. My weight class bumped up to a 55, and 2 kilos doesn't sound like a lot, but when you are someone that, sits around 116 pounds, which is that 53 kilo weight class, 2 kilos is a lot. That's bumping you up to 121. So my frame is just not one that holds that weight very well. I don't naturally sit that heavy most times, and I'm just not as competitive as a 55. I do have this whole career of coaching, and that really does take priority. So I couldn't put training as my first thing many times. And I've just realized that I can be more competitive as a 49. I'm someone that hates to lose. And if I can do it and challenge myself to cut the weight and then maybe squeeze out a medal here and there, I'm going to, challenge myself to do it. And so that's kind of been the motivation behind it. Can I do it? And then can I be competitive at it?
Right. That's awesome. When I was a high school coach, we had a competitive weightlifting team, and we would go to meets, and we would go to the national level meets, and there just wouldn't be a lot of people there. But now with CrossFit, and I think it's primarily because of CrossFit, it's boomed, which is good. It's a great sport, and it's something that you, like yourself, you can do until I've known guys that lifted when they were 70 years old in national masters and stuff. So it's a lifetime activity that you can do on and on and on again. So that's cool.
Absolutely. And especially for my career, I think being competitive in a sport that has crossover to what I do in my day-to-day just really helps me as a coach, but also helps me to relate back to my athletes. So it's really kind of twofold.
Good. Okay. So now I wanted to get that out of the way because you told me, because I think the first weight class that you ever competed in was 53 or 50.
Yeah, I was a 53.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So let's talk about your motivation to become a strength coach, and how did it all start?
Yeah, I get asked this question all the time. And I love it.
It's a stereotypical first question of a strength coach podcast, but I think it's cool because everybody's journey is different.
Yeah, and I love the question because it allows me to kind of talk a little bit about my life growing up and how much strength and conditioning has played a role. So I'm the youngest of 5 kids, and I have 2 older brothers. I have 2 older sisters as well, but my brothers were really kind of my idols growing up. I thought they were the coolest people ever. They're about 9 and 10 years older than me, so there is a pretty big age gap. And when I was really young, they were just so athletic. We always played basketball, we played football, we played baseball, we did all the stuff. And I always gravitated toward them because I wanted to be like them. Again, they were just so cool to me as a kid. And so growing up, we had one of those old school benches and weights in our house. And my brothers, who are 15 and 16, would go work out, and I would just hang out and work out with them. They would let me rotate it and bench the bar, and I'm super young, But I remember one day in particular, my brother brought the barbell and weights out to our patio, and he goes, "Look what I did." And so he showed me a movement, and it was, he either snatched or he cleaned or he did something. And I was like, that's the coolest thing ever. I just remember that moment being captured as the pinnacle of awesome. Yeah. And that sticks out to me a lot. And so as I was kind of going through life, I've always been a gymnast. And so being athletic and being around weights and all of that just came really natural to me. And so by the time that I got to college, I told people I was going to be an athletic trainer because I thought that that was my way to get into athletics. And when I got to college, I met the strength and conditioning coach there. And I was like, wait, this is a job? It's I can work on the performance side of athletics, and I don't have to rehab people and touch feet and do all this weird stuff. I was like, sign me up. And so I think my brothers played a really big role for me early on in my life. But then going to college and meeting my strength and conditioning coach, he was really kind of the person that opened the door to all of the potential of, making this a career. So that's really how I got started.
And, it's really amazing how many people have told a similar story that didn't know that strength and conditioning was a career.
I had no idea.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
So of all the people that you've worked for or work with, who was the most influential coach or person that you've worked with?
Do I have to pick one? Only one?
No, you don't. No.
Yeah, I really credit basically three people to be my mentors. I mean, obviously my strength and conditioning coach in college really opened my eyes to stuff, and I probably should credit him more as being a mentor, but my time with him was so limited, and I was more an athlete under him than I was a coach. So I would say my first real big influence was Stephanie Tracy Simmons, who was the director at the University of Kentucky when I got there. And that was, over 11 years ago that I stepped foot in that weight room. And I just remember being so impressed with how organized and just the intensity that she had with everything. And then for me to be a young woman in the field and get to have someone like her to look up to, that was just really huge and influential at that time in my career. So definitely her. During my time at Kentucky, I did go from Olympic to football. So there was a point in time where I was football only at Kentucky, and the head strength and conditioning coach there was Corey Edmond, and he's still there.
Yeah.
I was with him for a very short amount of time, but the things that I learned under him were just priceless, because he taught me more than, the sets and reps and the X's and the O's of strength and conditioning in regards to football. But he was like, we would just have life conversations. He's like, what do you bring to the table as a human? You're more than just a coach. Mm-hmm. Like, who are you as a person? And really made me think. And I appreciate that time that I had with him. So I always credit him as a mentor. But my last one that I would say is Tim Contos, who's at VCU. He was my director for my first ever full-time position, and he just was amazing and very patient with me and helped me learn a lot as a really young coach. So we still chat all the time, and he's a really big influence in everything.
Was Greg Golden at VCU when you were there?
Yes, and Greg and I are such good friends. Yeah, he's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. Who else was on the staff?
So when I was there, it was Tim Contos as the director, and then Gil Marrera was the other assistant. Michael McCautry was there, and he is now the director officially. So he's really kind of climbed the ranks. Greg Golden was there for the men's side for basketball. Buddy Donnelly was the women's side. And then after Greg left, Don Brown took over the basketball side for the men. So that was really just a high caliber staff.
Yeah, and they've been good for a long time. That's super. Greg, was here for a while.
Yes.
And you talk about fired up, man. He brought the pain every day.
That guy is like all gas, no brakes.
Yeah.
Just naturally.
Yeah, he did an incredible job. And our support staff, and it wasn't a long time ago, but for our sports nutrition department and some of the other things that we did here were not that big or not as big as they are now. And so Greg had to wear a lot of hats while he was here, and he did it well, man. He looked over every aspect from feeding to training to rehab to academics. I mean, he did it all here and did an incredible job.
I'm not surprised. I remember meeting him very early on in my time at VCU and feeling like I got hit by a tornado. I was like, who did I just meet? What was that?
So when you were at Kentucky working with the football team, so how did that go over, you being a woman, that weighed 115 pounds, and then you've got guys in there that are 315 pounds. So did you ever have to jump up and headlock one of them, or how did that go?
No. I think early on when I started, a lot of the athletes were pretty hesitant. They were like, who's this chick standing next to the rack trying to tell me how to lift weights? And then I kind of understood my role more was going to be helping some of the players that I would call troublemakers. So
you had the prisoners, huh?
Yes. So the staff at Kentucky would pair me up with people that maybe weren't awesome at following rules, or maybe were getting into trouble, or were having academic issues. And so I would work one-on-one with a lot of the players. And I took those opportunities to really learn about them and figure out a way that I can relate to them, because I knew if they saw me as a human and understood that I could talk with them a certain way, or I could relate to them a certain way, they would really buy into what I was saying, or me helping them with weights or whatever it would be. So I really worked on building one-on-one relationships. And then I think one of the biggest turning points for me with that program was I was training for the Kentucky State meet, and they were having some off days once a week or whatever it was. I don't remember at the time, during the week. And I would go in on the off days and train. And a couple of them would be in there and they saw me training and they're like, wait a minute. They're like, you actually know what you're talking about when you're correcting me, because they were able to see what I was doing. And after a bunch of them saw me training, it really helped to accelerate the buy-in process. And by the time that I left there, I remember having a conversation with one of them, and he's like, I'm really going to miss you. Like, I didn't think we would relate so well, but like, you're going to be missed when you're gone. So that was a really cool.
Awesome. And you probably outlifted some of the DBs and wide receivers.
I don't know about that. They were definitely an impressive group, and I just was always in awe of, the talent and the athleticism there. So it was really a valuable time for me.
Well, early in your career, you've done your fair share of grunt work and internships. How did that time as an intern in GA influence you, and what advice would you give young coaches that want to get into the field?
Yeah, it is the grunt work part of it, and I think it's really thankless sometimes, and you really are at the bottom of the totem pole. And I think internships and how you handle that and how you approach them can really make or break your potential future career. So during that time period, it was a lot of work, not a lot of sleep, not a lot of pay, if any, if you got any. It taught me a lot about work ethic and like what I'm able to do, because that time frame was tough for me. And I remember, one day calling my mom and crying and being like, can I quit? Like, I'm done. She's like, no, you committed to this, you follow through and you finish. And
wow.
Yeah, my mom's a tough woman. Yeah. And, just that mindset of like, I can get through this because it's going to lead me to what I want to do. And so I would say if you are an intern or someone really young in the career, and this is really something that you want to do, maybe not every day is going to be, the way that you want it to go, or you're going to have tough days, or you're going to, run on minimal sleep or whatever it is, but you really just need to hang in there and grind it out, because these are really valuable moments that you can look back to when you are in the position that you want to be in. So stick with it. You will make it. But it is a lot of lesson learning, and I think it's super valuable later on in your career.
If my math is correct, and I tried adding all these sports up, you've coached, I think, 11 different sports in your career.
Yeah, I didn't even realize that myself. So when you told me that, I was like, wait, what?
Yeah. You've coached 11 different sports, and then when you include gymnastics and weightlifting, so now you have, some really good experience in 13 sports. Mm-hmm. To what effect, if any, has that played in your coaching style and in your training philosophy?
I think it's really helped me to be very well-rounded as a coach, and your ability to connect to a variety of athletes is super important in this field. I always tell people, like, we're in the service industry, and your ability to build relationships is going to be important for your success and the success of your team. And so although it may seem like a lot in terms of variety of which I've worked with, you will find that there's a lot of carryover between teams. And just your ability to connect becomes so much better because of the amount of people that you're exposed to. So I would say that that's been super important. As far as philosophy of training and things like that, again, I think you find carryover in the sports. So it's not as dramatically different as maybe your typical person would think. Workouts for certain sports, even though they play different things, could look very similar because it's the need of the sport can be very similar. So just a matter of how you deliver the product.
Yeah, with your weightlifting background, do you program snatch and clean and jerk for your teams?
So here at Tennessee, I have not implemented any snatching movements yet. I do some cleans with some of my athletes. So we have gotten to that point. When I was at VCU, I snatched, clean and jerk, everything with all of my athletes. I thought that was super important for the groups that I have had. But I've gone in kind of cycles and waves of sometimes I do it with my teams and sometimes I don't. And is it appropriate here? Is it not? Because I've learned that that's not the only way you can train. You can definitely train other ways and get similar benefits. And so it's just a matter of, I think, where I am in my thought process at the time.
Well, and with your two teams, they basically play year round. And it's hard to program, I think, for teams that have a fall season and a spring season. And, you know, you can go out and do y'all have an indoor tennis facility at Tennessee?
We do. Yep. Yeah.
So they like ours here at LSU, they play year round, and soccer, you know, has the fall season and then they have the spring season. So not a lot of time for off season snatches and clean and jerks for sure.
No. And I think that's why. Oh, sorry. What were you going to say?
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that's kind of why things go in cycles, because there's going to be time periods where it's appropriate to do that, but maybe it's not appropriate year round. So you really just kind of work through that.
Now, this is a weightlifting question.
Okay.
So of the two lifts, the snatch or the clean and jerk, what's your favorite?
For me personally?
Yeah, for you personally.
A snatch by far.
Yeah.
Way I love to, like, if I have snatch on my program that day, I'm like, awesome. If I've got clean and jerk, I'm like, man, like, I much prefer to do a snatch over a clean and jerk.
All right. What about front squats versus back squats?
Oh, front squat all day. I hate back squatting.
Yeah. So now, as far as contributing to your overall lifting, you think front squat contributes more to your total than back squat?
I don't know that necessarily it contributes more, because obviously the bigger your back squat, the higher your front squat's going to be, which then elevates the ceiling for your potential cleans. But for me, I always tell people, like, I'm not a very strong lifter. I'm a very technically efficient lifter. And so my back squat numbers have been the same for years. But my Olympic lifting numbers continue to go up. And so I don't know if it has more carryover, but I prefer the positioning of a front squat over a back squat anyway, but your back squat's going to build everything else. So it's a great foundation.
All right. What about snatch versus clean pull?
Which do
you prefer?
Snatch all day. I hate pulling from the ground too. I just hate heavy movements.
Yeah. So you're not one to do deficit pulls either, huh?
Not unless my coach programs them, but I'm not just gonna go out there and pull that out myself.
All right. Of the three primary overhead movements, press, push press, or power jerk, or squat jerk, which do you prefer?
Oh, well, squat jerk is really pretty.
It's
so Yeah, so I mean, if those are my options, I'm probably gonna pick that because it's just a movement that is not seen often, and when done correctly, it's technically so pretty. I don't know if you're aware, I have a major shoulder injury, so anything overhead, I really try to limit.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So did you hurt it lifting, or it's just something that has progressively gotten worse over time?
So I believe I heard it while I was a collegiate gymnast. I had a lower body injury when I was in gymnastics, and so that forced me to do bars only for a while. And I think the 3 hours of swinging bars just really irritated my shoulder. And so with weightlifting, it's more so managing what I'm able to do, because I still am able to do stuff. I'm just, some days I'm not as stable overhead as I could be. So.
Yeah. So you're constantly probably hammering all types of shoulder rehab, and
we get very creative on how we do some overhead movements some days based on how my shoulder's doing.
So, all right. So this leads into this last question here.
Okay.
Of all the different weightlifting exercises that you've done, which is your least favorite? Like if you get your workout from your coach and you look at it and then you're like, oh my God, my knee hurts so bad. Or my shoulder's just not going to do that. So what's your least favorite of all?
My least favorite?
Back squat.
It's probably back squat or like a really heavy clean pull. I hate the internal grinding feeling that you get when you have to push through a really heavy rep. That's probably why I'm not a power lifter.
Yeah. So with all of your experience in weightlifting, and this was probably more prevalent when you were younger, did you ever find yourself adding weightlifting exercises to your athletes' programs because you liked coaching them and watching your athletes perform them?
Yeah. So very early on in my coaching career, my first Division I internship was at the University of Kentucky. They are a very Olympic-based program. Everything is influenced by the Olympic movements. And so I've always felt very comfortable teaching and coaching those movements for my athletes. And that was always my default because I really didn't have any other basis of how should I program. So the Olympic lifts were very influential and they were really my comfort zone. And I didn't really get challenged outside of that until I got to Clemson, where it was like, hey, do you realize that you can do other things? And I was like, oh. So I did find that I would program that way. My philosophy really kind of banked on that, but it was because I knew that I was technically very good at coaching and teaching it, but also I understood the movements, and that was how I learned how to program as a young coach. So yeah, always my default.
So how did you get into weightlifting? Did you just walk in the gym one time and say, I want to start lifting weights, or how did that happen?
No, this is also a really fun story. So when I was at the University of Kentucky, I interned there for a summer. And at the end of the summer, they mentioned that there was a graduate assistant position that was going to be open and that I would be considered for the position. But they gave me a stipulation, and they said the person that we want in this position needs to compete in Olympic weightlifting. Are you open to that? And I said, if that's going to get me the position, yeah, I'll do it. With no basis as to any kind of training. Am I even going to be good at it? Nothing. I just was all in for the grad assistant position, and I was going to do whatever it took to get it. But
why was the stipulation for weightlifting part of the requirement?
Because they really wanted coaches that had a background in a competitive sport,
Yeah.
And I think just to give me a hard time, I think they always were like, well, gymnastics doesn't count. Like they were always like, you're not an athlete. And I think it was just to like rile me up because they knew that was a button for me. So all of their coaches in some degree have competed in Olympic weightlifting or another competitive sport. And they think that that's a really important quality. And so I was open to doing it.
Yeah. You did gymnastics, you ran track, and you're a competitive weightlifter. Of those three, which have been the most challenging for you?
So, gymnastics has come really natural to me. I've done gymnastics since I was 5. My mom was a gymnast. Like, it was a lot of fun, and it was just her being like, go do that, try this. Like, so that was really simple. That's never been tough. There have been tough moments. Absolutely. As you run into when you do a sport for 17 years. So that was, I wouldn't say that was tough. Weightlifting also was a very natural transition for me. The toughest part and also the shortest career was the track aspect. I did it when I was in high school. I actually didn't run. I pole vaulted. And
wow.
Yeah.
The most dangerous sport.
But the best transfer for someone that has a gymnastics background.
Yeah.
And so the story of how I got into track was the track coach used to come to my gymnastics practices when I was in high school and used to ask me to come out for the team because they needed pole vaulters and they knew that gymnasts really kind of fit the criteria of what you need to be good at pole vaulting. And so it was not a natural fit for me in that I never thought to go out for track. And I also had never done a pole vaulting movement. And so my first stipulation was I don't want to run because I'm terrible at running. Like I said, I'm not running miles every day at practice. So let's agree on that. And my first day of practice, it was a high school team. And the coach was showing me how to pole vault, and he's showing me how to do all of this stuff, how to hold the pole, how to maneuver things. And I watched him and I said, hey, that's great and all, but I'm a lefty, so I need you to teach me on the other side of my body. And he goes, oh, well, I don't know how to do that, so you're going to have to learn righty. So I had on the opposite side of my body that I was like naturally athletic on. So that was really, it was tough.
That's amazing. And so you learned to pole vault right-handed.
I learned to pole vault, and I told him, I said, hey, if we do it this way, I'm never going to turn over the pole. Like I know that I don't turn that way. And so I used to pole vault kind of like a high jumper where they like straight body back over the pole. That's how I pole vaulted because I was like, I'm not turning. Yeah.
So when I have a great pole vault coaching story. So when I was my first year as a high school coach, they told me and one of the other football coaches that we had to coach track because our longtime track coach had retired. So that spring we started coaching track, and the first meet that we went to, because the school had been really good in pole vault prior to us taking over the job. And so my buddy said, why don't you go over there and watch the pole vault and see if it's something that you can coach. And so my high school didn't have track and field in Tennessee. So I'd never really watched it except for a few times on television. So I go jogging over there, and the guys are laying out their marks on the runway and they're running down the thing with the pole vault pole, and they would get to where they stick the pole vault pole, and they would just run up on the mat. They're working on their steps. So I'm like, oh, this is easy. I got this. So the first guy So the first guy, he must have been a lefty learning right-handed. The first guy runs down through there with his pole. He sticks the pole in there. He starts to go up, and then he got stuck at the top. And he fell backwards, and when he put his hands down, he broke both his wrists. Right, his arms snapped right in front of me. So people start running around crazy. Of course, there was an ambulance nearby, so the ambulance crew comes over there. So there's big commotion. So after, the guy was stabilized and they got him on a cart and carried him off, I go jogging back to my buddy that's coaching another event. He goes, "What do you think? Can we do it?" And I was like, "Absolutely not." And so we deleted pole vault from the track and field program for the next 5.5 or 6 years that we coached it. So my first day as a competitive high school track coach, I watched a poor kid break both arms.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Terrifying. But I almost wish that you would have been like, absolutely, we can do that.
No, I was like, no way. There is no way.
That's
that
crazy.
I was going to do that. But so, I guess, and, because you have to be very quick and agile, to be a gymnast. And then pole vault is a whole nother level of athleticism and bravery. So when I was the really good weightlifters that I had when I was coaching it in high school were fearless with the barbell in their hand. And I coached guys that it didn't matter how heavy the bar was, whether it was snatch or clean and jerk, they would dive under any bar that they could pull off the ground, and they were fearless. And so that's probably why you've kind of gravitated, to the sport of weightlifting, because gymnastics is something where you're flying through the air, and then pole vault, is literally flying through the air.
Yeah.
Now, what did you specialize in gymnastics? What was your primary event?
So when you're young, they make you,
yeah.
Well, So when you're young, they make you train everything. So for women, there's 4 events. So you have the uneven bars, vault, beam, and floor. When I got to college, I did floor, the uneven bars, and vaults. Not really great at beam. Like I could do a bunch of really cool flips on it, but like I couldn't stay on the beam. So that's kind of the point. It's tough. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I had a lower body injury when I was in college. And so I really just focused on bars for a long time. And I was very, very consistent. And was it the most flashy? No, but I could score really well. So I would say bars is probably my specialty, followed by vault and then floor.
Yeah. So did you have an ankle injury?
No, it's absolutely crazy what happened. I was tumbling. I landed short on a pass. Like I landed on my toes, with such force that it pulled all of the muscle and everything in my foot that it actually cracked my calcaneus, my heel.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I didn't even touch my heel to the floor, but because of how much force I was landing on my toes with, it messed up my heel. And so I couldn't jump or run or do anything for a very long time. So I was in a boot and crutches, and I would go to meets in a boot and crutches, and I would take all of it off, do my bar routine, do a dismount, and put all of it back on.
Wow. Yeah, the girls, the ladies that did gymnastics here at LSU were some tough women. Sometimes they would come into the weight room because they trained at our facility. Mm-hmm. And they would come in, and if there were 15 of them, 3 of them were on crutches, or one of them had shoulder surgery, with her arm in a sling. It's a tough sport, man.
Yeah. I watched, I don't remember what it was on, but there was something that I watched that gymnastics is a deceiving sport in that to, a regular population person, they look at the participants of gymnastics and they seem so frail and feminine and, easily broken. And, you look at these small, petite women and it's like, when you really get to it, it's like, they're very strong and very tough and very brave and very much the opposite of the appearance of what most people think.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. They're and they worked so hard. And so one of our football strength coaches trained him, Earl Chevalier, trained gymnastics for probably 10 years, maybe 12 years of his career here. Now he's transitioned into track and field, but he did gymnastics for a long time. So we would talk a lot about gymnastic training. And, I heard in one of your podcasts where you stated that gymnasts run terrible.
Yes.
And I always, when you looked at vault, so obviously speed was very important for vault. And you would see the ladies run down the runway and it looked like they were carrying a pizza sometimes, or, running. And I also often wondered why they didn't work on that more. But now that is something that Earl really focused on a lot with our gymnasts was, developing speed, acceleration. And he spent a great deal of time during the off season, not the preseason, but during the off season. The first thing that you would see our gymnasts do was sprint work at the beginning of every off season program. Mm-hmm. So I always thought that was cool.
Yeah. Speed is very important, but the technical side of it, like making sure you're hitting certain movements or whatever it may be, or certain shapes, I think gets lost on people sometimes because gymnasts are running full speed at an object. Yeah. You're not just running freely, so you have to be very calculated in your steps. And I think that gets lost sometimes.
Yeah. Very similar to pole vault. Mm-hmm. Very similar to it. When I was at Tennessee, we had at one time, we had two, maybe three NC2A champions in pole vault on the track team, gold medalists and a world champion. We had Lawrence Johnson, Tim Mack, and another. But I know Lawrence Johnson and Tim Mack were both world champions, and maybe Tim Mack was way up there in the Olympics. I think he may have won a silver medal in the Olympics in pole vault. So cool sport.
Yeah. And the track program's very good here, very decorated.
Yeah. So let's get to some of your foundational principles in training philosophy. Of all the sports that you've worked with, when you take into consideration the scheduling and the number of athletes that are on the teams and the type of athletes and the energy systems and stuff like that, is there one sport that has been more difficult for you to program for? Of all the different variables that go into programming, what's probably been the toughest sport that you've ever worked with?
I don't know if this is going to out me because one of my teams is women's tennis. Yeah. Sports that have a rotational component, for me, really kind of trip me up sometimes. Yeah. And I think people are like, well, you rotate in gymnastics. It's like, yeah, but rotation initiation in gymnastics versus how rotation gets initiated in a sport like softball is very different as far as sequencing is concerned. And so I'm very good at linear movement and things like that. I can understand that very well. Gymnastics, you flip around and it's great, but you're moving in one, path. And weightlifting, I'm not rotating at all ever. So just trying to understand how to progress rotational movements for sports that's a very big component of, such as tennis, such as softball, such as lacrosse. That I think has been the toughest part for me because it can be initiated so many ways. And how do you make a rotational movement powerful? So I would say that's been my biggest obstacle and probably the hardest part with working with certain teams.
All right. So this is probably a rhetorical question, or I know it is. You obviously probably throw a lot of med balls, right?
Yeah. We do. Yep. I've learned to adapt a little bit in going into some med ball variations and how can you really manipulate those. I've started with some anti-rotational core stuff. So I've kind of correlated rotational movements to building up the way that you would a regular program. So you have to build the foundation of everything first. And so I try to build strength. And then from there, that's where you try to build your power and your rotation. So I've also learned to adapt with some landmine variations as well, because I've learned that you can rotate very well with those and you can make it quick and you can add weight. So I've learned over the years, but I think early on that was definitely a hard concept for me to grasp.
When you're programming for your sports, how do you balance out bilateral and unilateral squatting? Is that something that you pay a lot of attention to?
Yes, it is. I always make sure, like I always think about filling certain buckets, and filling the buckets and how you do it for me is dependent on frequency and exposure to what we're doing. And so how can I do it within a week or how can I do it within a cycle? So as far as the single leg versus, double leg or bilateral, unilateral, the way that I work on that is I always have my bilateral strength movement. That's going to be probably one of my main components. So that's either your trap bar deadlift or your back squat or your front squat or whatever those movements are. And then when I go into unilateral, I categorize them into supported and unsupported. So there might be some unilateral movements that we do where one leg is the only one that's doing anything. So for me, it's like that's a step down or something along those lines, whereas a supported unilateral movement is going to be something more like a lunge where both feet are on the ground, but you're in a unilateral stance position. And so I try to hit both of those in a program as well. So hopefully that answers that question. But.
Yeah, no, it did. It did because, in football, bilateral or back squat is, the primary movement for, I think, most programs and most of the programs that I wrote. But there's also the importance of doing a single leg movement that you have to do, especially for your skill position players. But the majority, if you look at rosters, the majority, especially on offense, the majority of your players are offensive linemen. And then your front seven on defense have to be very strong and powerful also. So for me, it was hard for me, and I would have to make myself look for opportunities to put the single leg movements in there. And, it's like that for a lot of people, I think. And, Johnny Parker, one of my best, or probably my main mentor, would always say that lower body strength is the base of the athletic pyramid. So for me in programming, I had to make myself put unilateral movements in there because that was, squatting was something that I felt was critical for the development of our football team. But, it's a little different when you're working with soccer and women's tennis. So you have to look for other means to develop it. So.
Yeah,
how are the training days organized at the university? Especially when you're working with two teams, how do you balance the demands of those two sports in season and off season and work around all the other sports that are in the facility at the same time?
Yeah. So, as far as our facilities are concerned, we're very fortunate here when it comes to a scheduling standpoint in our facility because we obviously have our main weight room that we work out of, which is Carmichael, and all of our Olympic sports are out of here, minus our, men's basketball team, football and baseball. But almost all of our sports have a satellite weight room attached to their facility really? In some regards. So tennis has their own facility over at the tennis courts, and soccer has their own weight room over at the soccer complex. And the swim team has that. The track athletes have that. Basketball, men's and women's. Yeah. So we don't run into many scheduling conflicts in that regard. So it's been nice for us when it comes to that. But that also means that us as a staff sometimes are divided. So sometimes I have mornings where I'm over at tennis, or my afternoons are over at soccer, and I'm not always in our main facility. So that's been great from a schedule standpoint, because I know that a lot of universities can run into like, well, the baseball team needs to come in at 3, and it's like, well, so does track, and it's like, those are 2 huge groups. What do you do with that? So that's been great. As far as me personally, balancing women's soccer and women's tennis, they are split as far as their in season is concerned. So women's soccer is, competitive in the fall and does have the spring component, but really not as much weight is put into the spring games. And tennis is the opposite. So they have fall tournaments and they do all of that stuff, and it could be a bit more individualized, but really their competitive team season is going to be the spring. And so I am always one season in season, or one team in season, one team out of season. And that kind of, negotiates with scheduling stuff. So women's soccer in season, I see them about once a week in the weight room, and it's a quick session because their main reason for what they're doing is playing soccer in the fall. Whereas tennis, the main thing that they're doing is they're with me, and they're with me about 4 days a week. So it's easy to balance that way, especially because tennis goes in the morning, soccer goes in the afternoon. So it's been great from that end, but come spring, it's going to flip. And I'll see soccer more often, and I'll see tennis a little bit less. So as a coach, it can be a little tough because it's like you're always in season and you're always out of season. But from a scheduling standpoint, it really does work out because they tend to be opposites of each other.
So the Carmichael weight room, that's the old football weight room, correct? Yeah. So we have that in common. So
yeah.
Now, which are the offices still on the wall opposite of, well, there used to be a street out front. Is there still a street out front?
There is a street on the other side of these offices. I don't know if you've been here since they redid everything, but we have our offices on the opposite side of a garage door that leads out to the football practice fields. So.
Yeah, okay. So when I was there, all the male sports trained there, and then the women had a weight room across the street in the Stokely Athletic Center. But that's been torn down, and I think that's a parking garage now, correct?
Yeah, I didn't know about that. So we've got a parking garage, and then we've got Stokely, the residency hall. So. Yeah.
So all right. So across the street. That was called the Stokely Athletic Center, and that was where the original basketball court, basketball coliseum was.
Okay.
And all the administrative offices were there, and then they had Gibbs Hall, which was a dining hall and dorm room for the football players. And now, while I was there, we built the weight room at the Thompson Bowling Arena. For men's and women's basketball. But track and field did not have a weight room. And then baseball didn't have anything down there. So all the male sports trained right there in that weight room that you're in now. So it was cool, man. I really enjoyed the time that I spent there. It was only 4 years, but it was really a cool place to work. And then one of my best friends in my career is a coach there, Coach B. Roll, Coach Brad Roll. Superman. I've known him for over 30 years. I've known Coach Roll. He was the coach at UL Lafayette, the Raging Cajuns here in Louisiana when I was a high school coach.
Yeah.
Is he in the same facility that you're in?
He is. He's like 2 offices down. And there was one point that he walked by, and I almost was going to be like, Coach Roll's right here if you wanted him to come in. But he's here, and he's awesome. He is tough as nails, but also like super wise and very helpful. So
20-year NFL veteran strength coach also. And coached at the Miami Hurricanes. One of the coolest things, so when he was at UL Lafayette, I heard him speak at the UL Lafayette football clinic. And I said, if I ever make it to the big time, that's the guy I want to emulate. I just thought he was the baddest dude on the face of the earth. So then he left, went to Kansas. And then after Kansas, he got the job at Miami. And so back then there was no email or stuff like that, so I wrote him a letter. And I think I even put like $10 in the envelope. And he sent me a copy of his off-season program for the Miami Hurricanes. So years go by, and I get the head job at Miami. And when I walked into the office, there was this old filing cabinet that was locked in the corner of the strength coach's office. And I went over there and picked the lock with the screwdriver and was able to open it up. And there was a drawer full of Coach Roll's old workouts. And it was like finding a pot of gold to me.
That's awesome.
Just a super dude, man. And he would come in the weight room all the time while I was training. During the off season, I guess he lived in Miami. So it was cool. Always cool seeing Coach Roll come wandering in the weight room.
Yeah, he's been so great. And like you said, awesome football career, NFL career, but he coaches volleyball and men's tennis here now. And I just so appreciate that, he's had this really long career, and he looks at someone like me and he's like, well, how could I coach the women better? What insight do you have for me? Like, he's like still asking for critiques, even though, he's been doing it for so long. So it's really cool.
So you've coached a lot of different sports, and you're currently, doing soccer and women's tennis, two very different sports with vastly different energy systems and movement patterns. So they're like at opposite ends of the spectrum. How much time do you spend studying for your sports, watching film, looking at data, and trying to deliver a better product to the sport coaches?
Yeah. So I enjoy the challenge of them being so different, because I feel like it stretches me to be better as a coach, because I have to work on different opposite ends of the spectrum almost. I have had soccer in the past, and I've also had tennis in the past. And so I think previous experience has really helped a lot. Something that I don't think people really know much about is that I've never played soccer in my life. I've also never played tennis in my life. And so everyone's always like, how do you get these jobs? And it's like, I've actually had a lot of involvement in soccer throughout my career beyond, what it says on a resume. So I've been around the soccer community for a long time. I appreciate the sport, and I've watched so much of it that I think people sometimes get wrapped up in being so sport specific or into the details of, knowing the lingo. And that's definitely important because it helps create buy-in. But me as a coach, I'm looking at movement. What's their movement look like? What's the work to rest ratios that we need to be aware of? Like, that's kind of my mindset when I look at these sports. And so what I do is, for soccer in particular, I'm at every single practice. I see every single thing that they do. That helps me to figure out, like, does this movement make sense, or does this make sense? The other thing with soccer is that one of the biggest risks of injury is ACL tear, especially with female population at this level. And as much as it's unfortunate if an ACL tear happens, I really enjoy the rehab process of ACL. And I have done a lot of homework myself to understand, how does that occur? Why does that occur? Is there a way to prevent? And if not, how can I build the best rehab process for this athlete? So I've enjoyed that myself from some personal learning standpoints. And then I'm constantly looking at data for soccer. Like, that takes up so much of my time. We are on Catapult. There's so many different metrics that you can look at, and you can really dive down rabbit holes if you allow yourself. That can be endless hours. With tennis, though, similar thing. Maybe they do movements differently, but I go to their practices because sometimes they'll practice after a lift session, and I just watch. I'm like, how does this relate back to what we're doing? What type of footwork are they doing? How can we move this thing here? And with tennis, I have a lot of meetings with the coaches. and I ask for their input. And I'm like, what do you see here? What are some things here? And then I ask a lot for the tennis athletes. I'm like, what do you think about this? Because that's not a sport that I've studied as much, but I want to make sure that I'm doing the best that I can to service them the right way. So yes, I do my own research, but I also ask a lot of questions, and I'm very observant as to what's going on.
Yeah. Any GPS data, do y'all use that with tennis? Do they wear any type of bugs?
So nothing from a GPS standpoint per se. They do polar heart rate monitors when we're doing like conditioning sessions or things like that. But we're not utilizing it for any kind of like acceleration or speed metrics. It's more so just the heart rate component. So beyond that, they don't have any other technology that we have them wear.
Yeah. And now when you're conditioning for tennis, how long is a tennis match? A singles tennis match?
It depends. Like these things can go all day, because are you going to be someone that just serves and completely crushes your opponent every single time? Or is there going to be a really long, rally back and forth? Yeah. And so for us here, I haven't even gone through a spring with them yet. So I can't even give you hey, this is the type of team that we are. Yeah. I can hear about it from the coaches, and I can hear about it from the athletes, but until I see it in real time, I'm not 100%. So I know that in between serves and things like that, there's a certain amount of time that we need to be mindful of. And I know that certain athletes are going to go longer in their rallies than others, but there's really not a time limit in tennis. Yeah. It could be all day.
Yeah. There's a lot of acceleration, high intensity accelerations, decelerations, and it would be a neat sport to train, probably in some ways similar to volleyball, like beach volleyball or something. The movement patterns are going to be similar. Probably not as much jumping not at all jumping and pinning, but as far as the acceleration, deceleration, and stuff like that, it would be a lot like beach volleyball, I think.
Yeah, and they just have so much more like lateral movement, and like we talked about the rotational stuff. So I just have to be really mindful that we don't have to be necessarily fast in a linear pattern this way, but in a lateral pattern, how do we move across the court? Yeah. So
now, do y'all use force plates at Tennessee?
We do have them available to us. I do not utilize them.
Yeah. What about Nord boards?
The Nord board here that we have is stored in our sports medicine department. So we do utilize it, but it's not something that is really housed within our performance department. So it is available to us, and I think it's useful. It's just you can use it for other purposes too.
Yeah. Is there someone that works in y'all's department in strength and conditioning that helps you interpret all the sports science data, or do you do it yourself?
We do have someone that works on our sports science initiatives, but not as a full-time role. So he is also a strength and conditioning coach, works with some of our athletes. So a big portion, at least for me, I don't outsource him for any catapult. So all of the catapult data collection goes through me. Which is a hefty job.
Yeah, I know. It's a lot.
Yeah.
It is a lot. And especially if you have two different teams that are not very similar, I can only imagine how much time you spend looking at all of that. So now I have a territorial question here.
Okay.
I've worked with a lot of guys that went to the schools in Wisconsin, whether it be Whitewater or lacrosse and so on. So is there an issue with Garrett Mendenwald and him being a Whitewater guy and you being in Oshkosh?
No.
Any rivalry there?
No, I think it's helped us to build a better friendship, because we can connect over, being D3 athletes in the UW system. Because I don't know if many people know, but like the UW D3 system is like really high caliber. So
it is, yeah.
I think we can both appreciate that we were in that system, and now we get to be in a place like this. So no rivalries.
Okay. Because, I've had a lot. I've had a lot, probably 6, 7, or 8 guys that were from the area that were all, most of them grew up in Wisconsin, whether it was Milwaukee or Sheboygan or lacrosse. And there was always this rivalry between them, but they were all football players. And, but one thing that they all had in common were there's a few things: spotted cow beer, cheese curds, bratwurst, and Oktoberfest. So those were some of the things that they all had in common. Even I had a guy from Chicago, Lance Barlow, who played football at Carroll, and Carroll is in Wisconsin also. So there was always this rivalry between the guys. So I wanted to know if that was an issue with y'all.
Well, no, but I'm sure it's even worse for the guy that came from Illinois and went to Wisconsin, because I used to get, badgered, pun intended, badgered so much for being from Illinois and going to a school in Wisconsin. So, all
right. So here's a $1 million question. Were you a Bears fan or a Packers fan?
I'm a huge Bears fan. Come on. That's my team, right or die, good or bad. I mean, they're almost always bad. We won't say that. But no, I've loved the Bears ever since I was really young. And actually, fun story is when I was at the University of Kentucky, I had the opportunity to work with one of the Bears players that I looked up to. I got to actually train with Lance Briggs while I was there, and that was the coolest opportunity for me. So I am definitely a Bears fan.
So Lance Barlow was a huge Bears fan, and he went to school in Wisconsin, played at Carroll, and then he worked with a bunch of Packer fans that were from Wisconsin that worked for me, and they would go at it all the time. And when the Bears drafted Mitch Trubisky, Lance went into deep depression because he was hoping Jamal Adams, our safety at LSU, would be picked, but the Bears did not pick Jamal Adams. They took Mitch Trubisky, and Lance fell into a deep depression for 3 weeks.
I do have a fun story about the rivalry, if we have a minute for this.
Yeah, heck yeah.
So when I was at Wisconsin Oshkosh, the team doctor that we would see was also the team doctor for the Green Bay Packers. And so he would come in once a week and see the athletes. And there was a point in time where I was injured and I had to see the doctor. And I remember any time that I had a doctor appointment with him, I would purposely wear my Bears gear because I knew he was the Packers doctor.
Yeah. So. That's a heated rivalry. That's how heated it is. So that's
the subtle jabs are always appreciated.
So I think it goes without saying that conditioning is critical. All right, for sports and for any team, and it's the limiting factor in most teams' success. And I know that the beat test is the standard for fitness in soccer. What role does the beat test play at Tennessee? And this is something I ask everyone that has experience with soccer. Do you think it's something that could be adapted for other sports in training?
The beep test for us is definitely a standardized way and an objective way to really gauge where someone is at. And the demands of soccer are so high that we do have a minimum passing standard. And if you cannot pass that standard, for us, you are at a higher risk for injury based on the demands of the sport. So the athletes here are very aware of what the standard is and that they will be tested on it and that they need to have a conditioning level that can meet that in order to play. If they do not, we give them some opportunities to potentially pass in the future. But until they are able to pass that, we really don't put them in uncontrolled soccer situations. So it plays a role in that, like I said, it's very objective. You make it or you miss it. It's a pass or fail, and it gives us an idea of where they're at, and it lets us know the minimum standard for people. Beyond that, it's not like we're testing our athletes every week, things like that. Our testing is very minimal when it comes to the beep test of frequency. I think you can utilize it for some other field sports and just manipulate what is your passing and what's the standard for your team. Because again, as we talked about earlier, just because, soccer, field hockey, lacrosse are all different sports, if you break them down to the basics, it's like they're all field sports and we all have to figure out how to last for X amount of minutes on the field. So I think you can definitely manipulate some variables to make it work for your team.
Yeah. When you're working with tennis, is your program performance based, where you're trying to push the envelope for explosive strength and power and speed, or is it more to prevent injuries, in the shoulders and working on rotation, et cetera?
Sure. I would say that my program is a mix of both, based on the way that I program, because from my understanding, so I've only been here since April, so I haven't had a ton of time with both of my teams. But from what I understand, the way that tennis has trained in the past has been more prehab based and kind of like you were talking about, injury prevention. And one of the requests of the coach was, I want them under the barbell more. We need to be a little bit stronger. Yeah. So I have implemented some of the strength stuff like you're talking about. I've gotten them under the bar a little bit more. We actually did some testing. This was test week for them and they did amazing. But I still kind of pepper in a lot of the prehab stuff because it is very important to that type of athlete, especially for the longevity of their sport. Their season is long, their matches are long, tournaments can be very long. So they need to be able to maintain the stresses of that, but we need to be strong within there. The weak things break, like we talk about, and the stronger your athletes can be, the better it is. And so I've really tried to marry the two in my program for them.
All right. Based on your experience, I'm grilling you here, so
you are.
Yeah. Well, this is important, and you're an awesome coach. So this has been the best thing about not working is, once or twice a week, I get to have my own strength clinic.
Very true. Very true.
Yeah. So, and I'm addicted to strength and conditioning. I admit it. I'm in a serious 12-step process right now to deal with my strength and conditioning addiction.
That's great.
Yeah, I am. I miss all the people and stuff, but the thing that I miss, and I was talking to a friend yesterday, the thing that I miss more than anything is sitting in the office talking about training, because we would just sit and talk for hours and hours and hours about training. And that's what I miss the most. So that's why this podcast has been so much fun for me. So anyway, hang on. So I know that you've worked just a few more minutes. I got a few more questions. So I know that you've worked with softball in the past, and how big of a role did arm care play with softball? Because the throwing motion is different. Well, for the pitchers, the throwing motion is different. But can you talk about how you train them? You don't have to go in depth, but. So obviously that's something that was super important. The softball program at Clemson was brand new when I got there. So the very first year that I was there was their first year ever of a competitive season. And I don't think a lot of people really know that. And so for me, the goals for them was laying the foundation in terms of culture, expectations, and just basic strength stuff. As we started to progress them throughout the season and throughout their cycles of, being a Division I program, we really did start to
to implement a lot more of the arm care. And so every single day they did some type of shoulder prehab, and the variations that I got very creative on some push-up variations. I was very mindful of, are we barbell bench pressing versus are we dumbbell bench pressing? And I became very mindful of hand positioning when we were doing any kind of pulling. And so the other thing was that during certain times of the year, their pitch volume is going to be higher than other times of the year. And so you want to be very mindful of the amount of pressing that you're doing with them, because again, they're in that same movement a lot. And so our pitchers, even though the movement for pitching is different than a regular throw, like our pitchers, dumbbell bench pressed. We had athletes that came in with double shoulder surgeries and things like that. Wow. So if we were doing any kind of like inverted row or TRX row or anything like that, I would pull, I call it the football bar, the one that has all of the different grips. We would pull that stuff out so that they could be in a neutral position and still do the movements. We started every single day with some type of sprint and some type of shoulder prehab within their warm-up. So that is something that we were cognizant of and just mindful from a position standpoint of what we're doing with them.
Last question, I promise.
Okay, cool.
No, maybe next to last question.
Okay.
What are some things that you've noticed with incoming freshmen that they may be lacking in when compared to the older athletes in your program?
I think overall body awareness is one thing, because you find that at like that age range of an 18-year-old, for me, 18-year-old young woman versus a 22-year-old like grown woman, for me is very different. And so just overall awareness, but strength levels and just exposure obviously is going to be different, because you can get people that come in here that have never touched a weight in their life, and their first exposure is when they're a freshman here. Whereas a fifth year senior, I mean, you've got it down. You've been in the weight room for many seasons. You've gone through seasons of, your sport. Like, they're just a lot more experienced in that regard. So,
well, unfortunately, our time is up.
No.
Dang. I could talk all day. But thanks for joining us, and I really, really do appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, do me a favor and tell everyone on Rocky Top that the Moffitt family are cheering on the Vols.
Absolutely.
We're excited for the Vols, and they're playing so well. I don't see how they keep them out of the playoffs if they finish the season like they've been playing. Man, I don't see how you keep them out. They are really playing well.
They're doing awesome, and it's very fortunate that they literally practice right outside of my office. And I have to say, my first Tennessee football experience was the Tennessee-Alabama game, and I couldn't have asked for a better one to experience.
Ridiculous. The way they, oh my gosh, it was amazing. So, being from Tennessee, going to high school with a bunch of guys that went to Tennessee, it's been great. And the SEC and the NCAA need the volunteers to be successful in football. So it's been great. Yeah. And also, please tell Coach Roll that I said hello. Okay.
I will. Definitely.
Roll that I said hey. You can follow Coach Metzger on Instagram at Coach_Metz. At Coach_Metz. This brings us to the end of today's podcast. Thanks very much for tuning in. If you are someone interested in doing the podcast with us, or if there's someone that you would recommend as a guest on the podcast, please email us at podcast@themoffittmethod.fit. I hope, again, that you enjoyed this podcast as much as I did. So please subscribe and leave a review. For more information about the Moffitt Method program and everything that we have to offer, please visit us on Instagram at The Moffitt Method or on Twitter at Moffitt Method, and visit our website at themoffittmethod.fit. Thanks, and have a great day.